Nitpicks are inconsequential moments that occur in a piece of fiction. It's not the greatness of the event itself, but rather the degree to which it affects everything else in the film. That's not to say that nitpicks aren't important. If enough of them occur, they can cause a detrimental effect on the quality of the story. They may not affect the plot, but to have a script littered with them is still worse than one that doesn't. And if you're not careful, the overabundance of nitpicks can cause investment to crumble. Things like continuity errors or small editing mistakes are nitpicks, because the events of the film aren't altered by them being there. However, if in multiple scenes, minor editing mistakes are made, and some members of the audience can't help but notice them, then it can result in them being dragged out of the world being presented, since they are reminded, by no fault of their own, that this is a film, something the writers are trying to avoid. You are meant to get lost in the film, be invested in the struggles of the characters, and so whenever something happens that questions the believability of that world, then there's a problem. There is also the misconception that nitpicks are merely a subjective thing. Whilst they can be, they shouldn't be dismissed for that reason alone, nor should be disregarded as a valid dislike of something thanks to the mention of the word itself. It's still worth exploring the cogency of that apparent nitpick. Nitpicks as an objective issue is where the confusion lies, because nitpicks can also be objective criticisms. The subjective part then comes into play when considering how much it affects the individual on an enjoyment level and when weighing up the quality of the artwork by their metric. But even without the individual to decide how much it affects their view on the quality of the film, the nitpick still exists, and it's still worth bringing forward as a problem, because without it, the artwork would be categorically better. So when bringing up the actions of characters, and if the choices they make aren't consistent or have altered the plot in a major way, then it's no longer a nitpick. It then enters the realm of being a reasonable writing criticism, and the discussion should shift to whether or not that criticism is valid. For example, in Arcane episode 2, when the protagonists are getting chased by enforcers, they leave out the back door with the intention of escaping down the alleyway, but then more enforcers block their exit, meaning they're now trapped, which is when it's revealed that there's a ladder right next to them, despite this not being Vi's escape plan. Thanks to the serendipitous placement of the ladder, alongside being stopped in that exact place, they're able to get away. The event itself lasts no more than a minute, and it may seem like a nitpick, but if the characters hadn't been perfectly trapped exactly there, by the sheer coincidence of the enforcers rounding the corner when they did, then they wouldn't be positioned directly below the ladder they needed in order to escape. The plot would be drastically different had these pieces not come together so perfectly. It's not an impossibility, but it has entered the realm of a contrivance. The writers have shown their hand by not having things play out in a wholly realistic way, which is made worse by having the ladder be fixed in place. To rectify this, all that needs doing is to have the ladder be movable and for it to be set up that Echo is in the vicinity. He can still be the one to deploy it, but to just be shown that he loiters around in other scenes isn't enough of a justification. If he wasn't there for whatever reason, maybe because he was helping Benzo, which is something almost more likely to be the case, then the ladder would never have been pointed out or been reachable. It may not be the most egregious thing a writer can do to facilitate the survival of their characters, but it sets a precedent. If ever someone is in danger, the writer will invent something to save them. Granted, Arcane only does this a few times, but the problem of shoving in Deus Ex Machinas is indicative of a larger point, one that ought not to be misunderstood as a nitpick. We need to be able to understand the difference and implement these terms correctly if we're going to have a constructive conversation about film criticism. Otherwise, the conversation collapses and the metric employed by those involved can never be reconciled. You might think I'm looking for issues in an otherwise brilliant show by bringing up this Arcane example, but it's only to highlight an issue in the discourse. Arcane is a juggernaut of storytelling prowess, with a plethora of incredible characters to be invested in, but like everything else, it's not without its flaws. A more complicated example is that of the Stormtroopers in the Ahsoka series. In episode 6, we're introduced to a battalion that's been stranded in another galaxy and restricted to this one planet for over a decade. It's implied that their resources are low and survival has been difficult, which is why they're clad in red cloth and the armor is cracked in similar ways. But how each individual's garb has deteriorated isn't unique. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, although I'd like to see a few be broken and repaired differently, seeing as the 10-year span of being here must have caused some irregularities. There's a case to be made that they wouldn't all be bandaged up like this, and would therefore be considered unrealistic or poor world building on the part of Filoni. I would have liked to see different designs among them, but there is still credence to the belief that this would be a reasonable eventuality. After all, the Empire seems to champion the idea of homogenization. What's important is that this aesthetic choice doesn't change the events, and I'm willing to accept that my expectation isn't necessarily based on evidence or objectivity. For these reasons, it's closer to being a nitpick than the example provided in Arcane. But just because the conversation may steer towards a gripe being a nitpick, doesn't mean the discussion should end, as it might turn out, after enough digging, that the specific issue highlighted was worthy of more criticism.